The scent of hothouse lilies and old money was a physical presence in the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. A cloying perfume that clung to the velvet drapes and settled in the lungs. It was the smell of power. So thick, Naomi Brooks felt she could taste it on her tongue, metallic. Like a blood offering to the gods of finance and influence. Hundreds of New York's elite drifted through the gilded space. A murmuring river of couture gowns and bespoke tuxedos. Their laughter was a carefully orchestrated symphony, punctuated by the delicate chime of crystal flutes, a cacophony of hushed deals masked by the pleasantries of the string quartet. Naomi moved through it all like a ghost, her black uniform a deliberate void in the sea of shimmering color. She was an architect of invisibility, her movements fluid and precise, honed by years of serving those who were trained not to see her. She refilled a champagne flute, her expression a placid mask of professional courtesy, her mind 1,000 miles away, calculating the interest on her student loans. Then, the river of bodies parted. A stillness fell over the small circle around her, a subtle shift in the room's energy that was as palpable as a drop in temperature. At its center stood Eleanor Vance. She was not a queen in the fairy tale sense. There was nothing soft or benevolent about her. Eleanor Vance was a titan, the matriarch of the Vance Corporation, a global conglomerate with its tendrils in everything from media to pharmaceuticals. Her silver hair was sculpted into an elegant chignon, her eyes the color of a winter sky, and her smile was a thin, bloodless line. She moved with the serene confidence of a woman who had never been told no, a woman for whom the world rearranged itself. As Naomi turned with her silver tray, Eleanor raised a single, perfectly manicured hand, a gesture that stopped Naomi in her tracks more effectively than a brick wall. The conversations around them didn't stop, but they lowered to a conspiratorial hum. Everyone was watching. Eleanor's gaze did not meet Naomi's. Instead, it fell to Naomi's hands, which were steadying the tray of empty glasses. She inspected them as if they were contaminated artifacts, her lips curling into a semblance of a smile. "It's so brave of the catering company," Eleanor said, her voice a low, cultured purr that carried with lethal precision across the sudden quiet, to offer opportunities to those with less experience. She finally lifted her eyes to Naomi's face, a flicker of something cold and ancient in their depths. "Do be careful with the vintage crystal. Dear, it's far more valuable than you could imagine." The insult was a masterpiece of cruelty. Not crude or overt, but a perfectly calibrated dismissal. It wasn't about race. Not explicitly. It was about worth, about place, about the unbridgeable chasm between the woman holding the tray and the woman who owned the world it was being held in. A ripple of stifled amusement went through the onlookers. They looked away, feigning interest in their drinks, but their complicity hung in the air. Naomi did not flinch. She did not blush or stammer. A profound and unnerving calm settled over her features. Her spine straightened almost imperceptibly. She held Eleanor's gaze for a heartbeat longer than was comfortable, a silent acknowledgement of the strike. Then, she gave a small, correct nod. "Of course. Mrs. Vance. I will." But, behind her eyes, the gilded ballroom dissolved. The scent of lilies was replaced by the smell of chalk dust and old books. The string quartet faded, replaced by the echo of a single voice, calm and reasoned, being systematically dismantled. Flashback. The university auditorium was cavernous, all dark wood and intimidating portraits of long-dead deans. A 13-year-old Naomi sat in the back row, her hands clenched in her lap. On the stage, her father, Professor Alistair Brooks, stood at a podium, his face pale under the harsh lights. He was a brilliant academic, a man whose passion for ethical economics was infectious, a man who believed that knowledge could, and should, change the world for the better. And across from him, on the university's board of trustees, sat a younger Eleanor Vance. She wasn't attacking him, she was dissecting him, with a surgeon's precision and a voice devoid of emotion. She took apart his latest research paper, a paper that questioned the ethical foundations of several major corporations, including her own family's. She didn't call him a liar. She called him misguided. She didn't call him a fool. She called his work academically unsound and emotionally driven. She used his own idealism as a weapon against him, twisting his quest for truth into a narrative of reckless naivete that threatened the university's endowments. He was a good man, but he was not a fighter. He was a thinker, a teacher. He withered under the cold. Public scrutiny. The board voted to censure him. His funding was pulled. His reputation, the only currency he had ever valued, was left in tatters. He lost his tenure a year later. The light in his eyes dimmed, then went out altogether. He collapsed under the weight of a world that had no place for his brand of integrity. Present, the memory, sharp and painful, receded, leaving a cold, hard resolve in its wake. Naomi looked at Eleanor Vance, truly looked at her, and for the first time in years, the fear was gone. In its place was a quiet, burning clarity. This was not a random act of cruelty from a stranger. This was a continuation. Eleanor Vance had destroyed her father. She had orphaned Naomi from the world of ideas and opportunity he had promised her. And now, years later, she stood here, casually grinding her heel into the memory of him, into the very existence of his daughter. Naomi's reaction her unnerving. Placid composure was not acceptance. It was the quiet ignition of a vow made a decade ago in the shadow of her father's ruin. The world saw a server being put in her place. Eleanor Vance saw a nobody she had already forgotten. But what was truly happening in that gilded ballroom was the awakening of a ghost. The game had been set long ago, but now, finally, both players were on the board. The city's opulence was a language Naomi had learned to translate. The sleek, black town cars gliding down Park Avenue spoke of generational wealth, their tinted windows like redacted secrets. The doormen in their braided uniforms were gatekeepers to a kingdom of marble lobbies and silent elevators. Their polite nods, a constant, subtle assessment of who belonged and who did not. In the world of Vance, power wasn't shouted. It was whispered in the cut of a suit, the weight of a watch, the effortless assumption that the world was a stage built for their comfort. The Vance Corporation's headquarters was a monument to this principle, a spear of glass and steel that pierced the Manhattan skyline. Its interior, a sterile, minimalist cathedral of hushed ambition. The air inside was chilled and filtered, smelling of nothing at all, a vacuum where human messiness was not permitted. Naomi's world was a stark counterpoint, a fifth-floor walk-up in a corner of Brooklyn that was still more grit than gentrification. Her apartment was small, but it was a fortress of purpose. The living room was not for living. It was a war room. One wall was covered in a sprawling corkboard, a web of interconnected photos, names, and dates connected by colored string. At the center was a smiling, black and white photo of her father, Alistair Brooks. Branching from him were articles detailing his professional decline. And from there, the web expanded, ensnaring the entire Vance dynasty. Corporate filings, social registries, charity reports, and newspaper clippings were pinned in a meticulous, obsessive mosaic. She wasn't just a server. By day, she wore the uniform of the invisible, her ears open, absorbing the careless chatter of the elite. By night, she was a scholar of her enemy, fueled by black coffee and a cold, simmering rage, She was enrolled in online courses, not for a degree, but for a specific education: corporate law, forensic accounting, data analysis. She was arming herself with the enemy's language, learning to wield the weapons of loopholes and liabilities that they used to protect their gilded world. Her life was a study in contrasts. The forced, polite smile she wore at work versus the grim determination on her face as she traced the flow of dark money through Vance-owned shell corporations at 3 a.m. The deference in her posture as she served canapés versus the unwavering focus as she practiced her arguments in front of the bathroom mirror, dissecting Eleanor Vance's public statements, searching for weaknesses. She knew she couldn't attack the Vance empire head-on. It was a fortress of steel and influence, and she was a lone soldier with nothing but a library card and a dial-up internet connection's worth of inherited resolve. She needed a way in, a side door, a crack in the foundation. The opportunity arrived not as a trumpet call, but as a whisper. It was a discreet online posting from a high-end domestic placement agency. The language was coded, full of phrases like utmost discretion required and unique family situation. It sought a private aide and companion for the minor child of a prominent tech executive. The duties were vague, providing emotional support, facilitating a structured environment, assisting with non-traditional communication. The salary was astronomical, a figure that made Naomi's breath catch in her throat. But it was the name at the bottom of the agency's client list that made her heart stop. Grant Kessler. Naomi's research had already led her down the Kessler rabbit hole. Grant Kessler was a tech visionary, a recluse whose company, Kessler Dynamics, had once been a major rival to Vance Corporation's tech division. There had been rumors of a hostile takeover attempt by Vance years ago, one that had mysteriously failed. Then, 6 years ago, Grant's wife, Isabella Kessler, a brilliant programmer in her own right, had vanished without a trace. Shortly after, Grant withdrew from public life, and Kessler Dynamics stagnated, becoming a shadow of its former self. The connection was tenuous, a single thread in her sprawling web. But it was there, Vance and Kessler. A rivalry, a disappearance, a broken family. It was a vulnerability. It was the side door she had been searching for. She spent a week crafting her application. She didn't lie, but she curated the truth with the skill of a master strategist. She highlighted her volunteer work at a center for children with special needs. She framed her waitressing experience not as menial labor, but as a study in observational psychology and high-pressure environment management. She wrote a cover letter that was a model of empathy and quiet competence, a portrait of the exact person a desperate, reclusive father would want for his troubled child. She knew it was a long shot, but her father had taught her that the most powerful forces in the world are not armies or corporations, but ideas. And her idea was simple: to get inside the orbit of Eleanor Vance's world. You didn't knock on the front door. You found someone else's broken gate and offered to fix it. The Kessler estate in upstate New York was not a home. It was a mausoleum. A long, winding drive cut through acres of manicured but joyless gardens, leading to a sprawling stone mansion that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The air was heavy with the oppressive silence of unresolved grief. Inside, the grand foyer was a cavern of dark wood and cold marble. The only sound was the sterile hum of the air filtration system. The interview was conducted not by Grant Kessler himself, but by a severe-looking woman with a tightly wound bun and an air of proprietary authority. She introduced herself as Mrs. Davenport, the household manager. "Mr. Kessler is a very private man," she said, her voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "His son, Elliot, is sensitive. He does not speak, not since his mother disappeared." Naomi nodded, her expression conveying a deep, professional empathy she had practiced for hours. "I understand. My goal would be to create a space of safety and trust. Not to force communication, but to invite it." Mrs. Davenport's eyes, small and sharp, scanned Naomi's resume with unconcealed skepticism. "Your experience is unconventional. You've worked in restaurants." The statement hung in the air. An accusation. "I've learned to read a room without a word being spoken," Naomi replied smoothly. "I've learned to anticipate needs, to de-escalate tension, and to be present without being intrusive. I believe that's what a child like Elliot needs. Not another therapist with a clipboard, but a calm presence." Just then, a small figure appeared at the top of the grand staircase. It was Elliot. He was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with his father's dark, intense eyes and a fragile, bird-like frame. He didn't look at them. He was carrying a set of colored wooden blocks, and his entire focus was on arranging them in a complex, repeating pattern on the top step. Mrs. Davenport's lips thinned. "Elliot, go back to your room." The boy didn't respond. He simply continued his task, his small hands moving with an almost frantic precision. Naomi saw her opening. She rose slowly from her chair, her movements calm and deliberate. She walked to the base of the staircase, but she didn't speak to Elliot. She simply sat down on the bottom step and watched him, her posture open and non-threatening. For a full minute, she said nothing. She just observed the pattern he was creating: blue, red, red, green, blue, red, red, green. It wasn't random. Then, she spoke, her voice soft. "It's a sequence, a prime number algorithm. Isn't it, to determine the spacing?" Elliot's hands froze. Slowly, hesitantly. He lowered his gaze from his blocks and looked at her. It was the first time he had made eye contact with anyone. His eyes widened, not with fear, but with a flicker of dawning recognition. He looked at her as if she were the first person who had ever spoken his language. From the foyer, Mrs. Davenport let out a small, involuntary gasp. At that moment, a man emerged from the shadows of a nearby study. He was tall and gaunt, with a haunted look in his eyes that no amount of money could erase. His suit, though expensive, hung on him as if on a stranger's frame. It was Grant Kessler. He had been watching the entire exchange. He stared at Naomi, his expression a mixture of shock and something she couldn't quite decipher, a glimmer of hope so faint it was almost painful to see. "You're hired," Grant Kessler said, his voice rusty from disuse. "When can you start?" Naomi had done it. She had picked the lock. She was inside the fortress. The Kessler mansion was a fortress of silence, and its walls had guards. The primary warden was Mrs. Davenport, a woman whose loyalty to the memory of Isabella Kessler was absolute, and who viewed Naomi as an interloper, a threat to the carefully preserved stasis of the house. Her hostility was not overt, but expressed in 1,000 subtle cuts, forgotten messages from Mr. Kessler. Meals served cold, a constant, withering surveillance that followed Naomi from room to room. The rest of the staff took their cues from her, moving around Naomi with a polite, impenetrable distance. They were ghosts in their own home, and they did not welcome a new spirit. Grant Kessler was equally remote, an island of grief in an ocean of his own making. He spent most of his days locked in his study, the blue glow of monitors casting long shadows on his face. Their conversations were clipped and technical, focused solely on Elliot's schedule and needs. He was a man who had replaced emotion with logic, a father who loved his son but had forgotten how to connect with him. To him, Naomi was a function, a solution to a problem he couldn't solve. not a person. The greatest obstacle, however, was Elliot himself. He was a brilliant, locked-in child, his world a kaleidoscope of patterns, numbers, and symbols that no one else could understand. He did not speak with his voice. He spoke with his hands, with his drawings, with the intricate structures he built from blocks and Lego bricks. His room was filled with these creations, not childish castles, but complex, geometric models that looked like architectural blueprints or circuit diagrams. He would spend hours in a state of intense, silent concentration, and any attempt to engage him directly would cause him to retreat further into himself, his small body tensing with anxiety. For the first few weeks, Naomi felt like a failure. She was an alien in this cold, sterile world, her warmth and empathy deflecting off the invisible walls of grief and suspicion. Every morning, she would enter Elliot's room with a gentle greeting, and every morning, he would ignore her, his back turned, his focus entirely on the pattern he was weaving. She felt the weight of Grant's unspoken expectations and the sting of Mrs. Davenport's silent judgment. Her carefully constructed plan seemed to be crumbling. She was inside the fortress, but she was trapped in an empty courtyard, no closer to the inner sanctum than when she had started. She spent her evenings in her small, sterile room in the staff quarters, poring over books on nonverbal communication and autism spectrum disorders. But the textbooks offered clinical answers for a problem that felt deeply human. The doubt began to creep in. Was this a mistake? Had she overestimated her own abilities? Her own right to intrude on this family's sorrow for the sake of a long-dormant vendetta? The face of her father, smiling from the photograph on her laptop screen, seemed to ask the same question. One rainy afternoon, she found Elliot in the library, a vast, two-story room filled with thousands of books that looked as if they hadn't been touched in years. He wasn't building. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by several large, leather-bound photo albums, a look of profound, silent frustration on his face. Naomi entered quietly and sat on the floor a respectful distance away. She didn't speak for nearly an hour. They sat in shared silence as Elliot slowly turned the pages. They were filled with pictures of a smiling, vibrant woman with kind eyes. Isabella. Isabella in a garden. Isabella on a boat. Isabella holding a baby Elliot. In every photo, she was radiant. Then, Elliot stopped on a particular page. It was a photo of Isabella in a study, standing proudly next to a large whiteboard covered in complex equations and diagrams. He pointed a small, trembling finger at the whiteboard, then looked at Naomi, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading intensity. He pointed again at the board, then at one of his own block structures across the room. He tapped the photo, then his creation. The connection was clear. Naomi's breath caught. She crawled over to his block structure. It wasn't a toy. It was a three-dimensional model of the diagram on the whiteboard. He wasn't just playing. He was communicating. He was recreating his mother's work. This is what she did, Naomi whispered, her voice filled with awe. You remember it. You're showing me what she was working on. For the first time, a sound escaped Elliot's lips. It wasn't a word, but a small, affirmative hum, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. In that moment, the first brick in the wall between them crumbled. He hadn't needed a therapist or a caregiver. He needed a translator. And he had finally found one. That small hum was the key that unlocked everything. Naomi shifted her approach entirely. She stopped trying to bring Elliot into her world, and instead asked him to let her into his. She spent her days on the floor with him, not as a caregiver, but as an apprentice. She learned to read the language of his block structures, the syntax of his color-coded drawings. He was a prodigy, a silent historian of his mother's intellect. His creations were not just memories. They were schematics, data flows, elegant solutions to complex coding problems. Her new role gave her a reason to explore the house, with Elliot as her silent guide. She began to uncover the ghost of Isabella Kessler. She found her old office, locked since her disappearance. Mrs. Davenport was resistant, but Naomi, citing Elliot's therapeutic progress, convinced a reluctant Grant to give her the key. The room was a time capsule, unlike the rest of the cold, curated house. Isabella's office was a space of vibrant, chaotic energy. Whiteboards were still covered in her elegant, looping handwriting, a cascade of algorithms and theoretical code. Books on quantum computing and cryptography were piled high on every surface. It was the den of a genius at work. Tucked away in a desk drawer, beneath a stack of technical manuals, Naomi found a series of moleskin journals. They were not personal diaries filled with feelings of domestic unhappiness. They were work journals, filled with dense, technical notes, but interspersed were more personal, cryptic entries. EV is pushing again. She smells the potential, like a shark smells blood. She calls it a partnership, but it feels more like an annexation. Grant doesn't see it. He thinks business is just numbers on a page. He doesn't understand that for people like her. It's a blood sport. And then, the most chilling entry I have to protect Ariadne. It's too important. If they get it, they won't just own the market. They'll own the information. All of it. I've built a failsafe. A key. Elliot is the only other one who knows the pattern. EV. Eleanor Vance. Ariadne. The pattern. It all clicked into place. Naomi looked at the complex diagrams on the whiteboards. Then, at the block structures Elliot built every single day. They were the same. Elliot wasn't just remembering his mother's work. He held the key to it. This was no longer just about revenge for her father. This was bigger. Isabella Kessler hadn't vanished because of a failing marriage or depression. She had been targeted. A powerful, brilliant woman had created something revolutionary. And Eleanor Vance had wanted it. Naomi felt a cold dread mixed with a surge of adrenaline. She was standing in the middle of a crime scene, and the only witness was a silent little boy. Armed with the name Ariadne and the initials EV, Naomi knew she could no longer work in the shadows. She had to bring Grant into the light. She spent a night cross-referencing everything she had found Isabella's notes. The corporate history between Kessler Dynamics and Vance Corporation. The timeline of Isabella's disappearance. The picture that emerged was stark and terrifying. 6 months after Isabella vanished, Vance Corporation launched a new, revolutionary data encryption subsidiary called Aegis Security, its proprietary technology, which vaulted Vance Corp to the top of the data security market, was lauded as an in-house miracle. The patent, Naomi discovered after hours of digging through online archives, had been acquired from an anonymous shell company based in the Cayman Islands. The final piece fell into place. Aegis was Ariadne. She requested a meeting with Grant. He met her in the library, his face etched with its usual weary impatience. "Is there a problem with Elliot?" "No," Naomi said, her voice steady. "The problem is with what happened to your wife." She laid it all out on the large mahogany table copies of Isabella's journal entries, photographs of her whiteboards, next to photos of Elliot's block structures, and the printout of the Aegis security patent filing. She didn't accuse. She presented the evidence, piece by logical piece, speaking his language of data and facts. Isabella didn't disappear. Grant, She was erased, Naomi concluded, her voice low but resonant in the silent room. She created a technology so powerful that Eleanor Vance decided she couldn't buy it. So she took it, and she took your wife with it. Grant stared at the documents, his face draining of all color. He picked up one of Isabella's journals, his hand trembling as he traced her handwriting. The narrative he had built for 6 years, a story of a wife lost to sadness. A tragedy he could mourn passively, was shattering before his eyes. His grief, a cold and stagnant thing, was being replaced by a hot, galvanizing rage. She was afraid. He whispered, more to himself than to Naomi. She tried to tell me. She said Vance was playing a different game. And I didn't listen. I told her she was being paranoid. The guilt in his voice was a raw, open wound. He looked up at Naomi, his eyes, for the first time, clear and focused. The reclusive, broken man was gone. In his place was the ruthless tech CEO who had once built an empire. "What do you need?" he asked. His voice was no longer rusty. It was cold, hard steel. "Everything," Naomi replied. "Your resources, your access, your name. Eleanor Vance operates from a fortress of power and influence. We need to build a battering ram." He nodded slowly, a silent pact forming between them. The reclusive billionaire and the invisible waitress. An alliance forged in grief and a shared desire for justice. His passive sorrow had finally turned into a focused, powerful weapon, and Naomi Brooks was now pointing it directly at the heart of the Vance Empire. The war began, not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of servers and the relentless click of a keyboard. Grant's study, once a tomb of sorrow, became their command center. He unlocked his vast financial resources and his network of dormant contacts, while Naomi provided the strategy, her mind sharp and focused, her wall of strings and notes now recreated on a massive digital smartboard. They were no longer just seeking answers. They were building a case. Their first move was to find allies. Grant knew of a disgraced investigative journalist, Marcus Thorne, a man whose career had been torpedoed years ago by Vance Corporation's legal team after he got too close to a story about their unethical pharmaceutical trials. Thorne was now running a fringe political blog out of a dusty office, bitter and brilliant in equal measure. He hated Eleanor Vance with a passion that matched their own. When Grant called, Thorne didn't hesitate. He became their bloodhound, sniffing out old contacts and digging through digital graveyards for buried information. Next, they needed a source inside the Vance fortress. Naomi, using her knowledge of corporate structures, identified a potential weak link, Anya Sharma, a junior counsel in Vance Corp's mergers and acquisitions department. Anya was young, ambitious, but her social media footprint revealed a deep commitment to social justice, causes a glaring contradiction to her employer's reputation. Grant used a secure, anonymous channel to make contact. He sent her a single, encrypted file containing a fragment of Isabella's research, just enough to prove its origin. The message was simple. You work for thieves. Help us make it right. For a week, there was silence. Then, a trickle of information began to flow: internal memos, redacted acquisition documents, project timelines for Aegis security. Anya was their ghost, a flicker of conscience in the heart of the machine. Eleanor Vance was a predator, and she sensed the disturbance in her kingdom. The pushback was subtle at first, then chillingly direct. A routine IRS audit of Kessler Dynamics was suddenly launched, tying up Grant's assets. Marcus Thorne's blog was hit with a debilitating series of cyber attacks. One evening, as Naomi was walking home to her apartment, a sleek, black town car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, and one of Eleanor's polished, smiling lawyers sat inside. Mrs. Vance is an admirer of ambitious young women. Miss Brooks, the lawyer said, his tone pleasant, his eyes cold. She also believes that everyone should know their place. One must be so careful about one's reputation in this city. It's as fragile as a career, isn't it? The car pulled away, leaving Naomi's heart pounding in her chest. It was a declaration of war. The threat was no longer abstract. It was real and personal. But it didn't scare her. It galvanized her. She was no longer the invisible girl with the tray. She was a threat, important enough to be warned. She had made the Titan flinch. Working with Thorne and their anonymous source Anya, they assembled their arsenal, a digital dossier containing the definitive financial trail from the shell company back to a Vance-controlled slush fund. Sworn affidavits from 2 former engineers Isabella had tried to hire, who were later silenced with generous severance packages and ironclad NDAs. And the most damning piece of all, a recovered fragment of the source code from Ariadne, which matched the core of Aegis Security's code line for line. Their target was set: the Vance Corporation's annual shareholder meeting. Less than a month away. It was Eleanor's grand stage, a public forum where she projected an image of unimpeachable strength and integrity. It was the perfect place to burn her empire to the ground. The grand ballroom of the Hilton was a sea of dark suits and muted ambition, a sterile, high-stakes theater for the performance of corporate power. Hundreds of shareholders, analysts, and journalists filled the tiered seating, their faces illuminated by the cold glare of the stage lights. The air buzzed with the low murmur of anticipation. On the stage, behind a gleaming mahogany dais, sat Eleanor Vance, the embodiment of regal, untouchable power. Her smile was serene, her posture perfect. She was the master of her universe. Naomi and Grant sat in the front row. Grant, as a minority shareholder in a Vance subsidiary, had secured a 5-minute slot during the open Q&A session. It was all the time they would get. Naomi felt a tremor of fear, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach, but she pushed it down. She looked at Grant, whose face was a mask of cold resolve. She thought of her father, his life's work dismantled in a room just like this. This was not just for Isabella. It was for him. When their time came, Grant walked to the microphone at the center of the aisle. Naomi stood beside him, a silent partner. The cameras turned toward them. "Grant Kessler," he said, his voice echoing through the silent room. "A name I'm sure many of you have forgotten." Eleanor's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of ice entered her eyes. "Grant, a surprise to see you out and about. To what do we owe the pleasure?" "I'm here to discuss a matter of corporate malfeasance and intellectual property theft," Grant said, his voice calm and measured. "Specifically, concerning your flagship subsidiary, Aegis Security." Naomi stepped forward and placed a tablet on the podium. Its screen connected to the massive displays flanking the stage. She didn't speak. Her presence was her statement. She was no longer the server. She was the accuser. With cold precision, Grant laid out the case. The displays lit up with the evidence: Isabella's journal entries, the damning source code comparison, the labyrinthine financial trail that led from the shell company directly back to Eleanor Vance's personal chief financial officer. He spoke not with the emotion of a grieving husband, but with the dispassionate fury of a CEO whose most valuable asset had been stolen. The room was utterly silent. The only sound, Grant's voice, and the soft click of Naomi advancing the slides. When he finished, a wave of shock rippled through the audience. Eleanor Vance, however, remained unnervingly calm. She rose from her seat and approached the dais, a look of weary disappointment on her face. "This is a sad, desperate fantasy." "Grant," she said, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "A story concocted by a broken man and his ambitious young assistant." Her eyes flicked to Naomi, a flash of pure venom in their depths. But they had planned for this. They knew she would deny it. "You're right, Eleanor," Grant said. "It is a story, but it's not the whole story." He looked at Naomi, who nodded once. This was her moment. Naomi stepped up to the microphone. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was clear and resonant, cutting through the tension in the room. "This was never just about technology, Mrs. Vance. It's about a pattern of destroying brilliant people who get in your way." The screen behind her changed, displaying a photograph of her father, Professor Alistair Brooks, young and full of life. Eleanor's composure finally cracked. A flicker of genuine shock, of raw emotion, crossed her face. "My father discovered the truth about the Vance family fortune decades ago," Naomi continued, her voice gaining strength. "He found that it was built on war profiteering, on selling defective equipment to the military during the Vietnam War. He was your protege, and he trusted you. When he threatened to expose you, you didn't just ruin his career, you silenced him." Eleanor laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "You have no proof of that. It's a ridiculous, slanderous accusation." "Is it?" Naomi asked. "Because my father kept records. He kept everything." It was then that Eleanor, truly cornered, abandoned all pretense. Her mask of civility fell away, revealing the cold, predatory ambition beneath. "Your father was a fool," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that was nonetheless picked up by the microphone. "He was brilliant. Yes, but he was a naive, sentimental child. He didn't understand that to build an empire, sacrifices must be made. He stood in the way of progress, just like Isabella and her ridiculous idealism. They thought they could change the rules. The rules don't change." The admission hung in the air, a confession broadcast to the entire financial world. The room erupted in a cacophony of gasps and frantic whispers. But Naomi wasn't finished. She held up a small, sleek flash drive. "This contains the final piece of evidence," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "Proof that to cover the acquisition costs of Ariadne, Vance Corporation engaged in a systematic campaign of market manipulation. It details every illegal trade, every falsified report. If I release this, it won't just destroy you, Mrs. Vance. It will trigger a market collapse that will vaporize the pensions and 401ks of every employee in this company, and thousands more across the sector." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. She looked from Eleanor's horrified face to the faces of the employees in the audience, their expressions a mixture of fear and confusion. This was her moral crucible, total destruction, or something more. "I'm not you, Eleanor," she said, her voice softening. "My goal isn't to burn everything down. My goal is justice." She turned to the board of directors. "I am offering a third way. Eleanor Vance will resign, effective immediately. The board will welcome 2 new members, Grant Kessler and myself, to oversee a complete corporate restructuring, and a multi-billion-dollar restitution fund will be established to compensate the victims of this company's practices, starting with the families of Alistair Brooks and Isabella Kessler. You have 60 seconds to accept, or this drive goes to every major news outlet in the world." Silence. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound. Security personnel began to move discreetly toward the stage. The board members exchanged frantic, panicked looks. Finally, The lead director, a pale, shaken man, nodded his assent. It was over. Naomi looked at Eleanor Vance one last time. The Titan was broken, her face a canvas of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. She had been unmasked, not by an army or a rival corporation, but by the ghost of a man she had destroyed, and the quiet, relentless resolve of his daughter. The aftermath was a controlled explosion. As Eleanor Vance was escorted from the stage by security, her face a stoic mask of fury, the ballroom descended into chaos. The flash of cameras was a blinding strobe, the shouts of journalists a deafening roar. News alerts lit up every phone in the room simultaneously. The story of the Vance Corporation's spectacular, public implosion went global in minutes. Marcus Thorne's meticulously prepared article, complete with quotes, documents, and the damning audio from the meeting, hit the internet at the precise moment Eleanor was placed in a waiting car. It was a journalistic kill shot, a career-defining story that instantly made him one of the most respected investigative reporters in the country. In the hours that followed, the world's financial markets reeled. Vance Corporation stock was halted after plummeting 60% in pre-market trading. The SEC announced a full-scale investigation. Federal agents were seen entering Vance Tower with subpoenas. Through it all, Grant Kessler was a rock of calm in the hurricane. He immediately sequestered the remaining board members in an emergency session. Naomi watched from the adjoining conference room as he masterfully took control. He was no longer the haunted recluse. He was a leader, his commands precise, his vision clear, working with Anya Sharma, who was immediately promoted to interim general counsel. He issued a public statement. He didn't just promise transparency, he demonstrated it, outlining a clear, step-by-step plan to stabilize the company, protect the employees' jobs and pensions, and cooperate fully with investigators. His redemption was not just in finding justice for his wife, but in using his power to shield the innocent from the fallout of Eleanor's crimes. He was rebuilding, not just his company, but his own soul. Naomi felt a profound sense of exhaustion, the adrenaline of the past few months draining away, leaving a quiet, hollow space in its wake. She had won. She had avenged her father. She had brought a Titan to her knees. But the victory felt incomplete. The destruction was necessary, but it wasn't the point. Later that evening, she found her way back to the Kessler estate. It was quiet. The storm of the outside world held at bay by the familiar iron gates. She went to find Elliot. He was in his room, not with his blocks, but with a sketchpad and colored pencils. He looked up when she entered, a soft, knowing smile on his face. He held up the drawing for her to see. It was a simple picture, drawn with a child's hand, but filled with an adult's understanding. It depicted two figures, a man who looked like Grant, and a woman who looked like her standing together, not in front of a falling skyscraper, but in front of a new building, one with its doors wide open, in Elliot's silent, profound way. He was showing her the next step. The battle was over. It was time to build. 1 year later, a cool autumn breeze rustled the newly planted trees in a once neglected corner of Brooklyn, where a dilapidated warehouse had once stood. There was now a sleek, modern building of glass and reclaimed wood, a beacon of light and possibility in a neighborhood poised between its gritty past and a hopeful future. Engraved in minimalist steel letters above the entrance were the words, "The Brooks Kessler Center for Ethical Innovation." A crowd had gathered for the dedication ceremony. Community leaders, young tech entrepreneurs, university students, and journalists. In the front row sat Grant Kessler, his face relaxed and open, a genuine warmth in his eyes that had been absent for years. Beside him, Elliot, now chattering quietly about the architectural design, looked like any other bright, inquisitive boy his age. Naomi Brooks stood at the podium, not in a server's uniform or a power suit of confrontation, but in an elegant, simple dress that spoke of quiet confidence. She was no longer a ghost, an avenger, or an executive. She was a founder. "A year ago," she began, her voice calm and steady, carrying across the hushed crowd, "I stood in a different kind of room, and I spoke about destruction. It was a necessary act, born of a long overdue reckoning with the past. But revenge is a fire that consumes. If you let it, it will burn you down with your enemy, justice. However, justice is about what we build in the aftermath." She spoke of her father, not as a victim whose life was cut short by cruelty, but as a visionary whose ideas were simply ahead of their time. She spoke of his belief that integrity and innovation were not mutually exclusive, that success should be measured not by the height of one's fortress, but by the number of doors one opens for others. "This center," she continued, gesturing to the building behind her, "is the physical manifestation of that belief. It is a place for the brilliant minds cast aside by a system that values profit over people. It will fund the innovators, the ethicists, the dreamers, the people who, like my father, believe in building a better world, not just a richer one. It is a sanctuary for the Alistair Brookses and Isabella Kesslers of the next generation." Her revenge was finally complete. It wasn't in the newspaper headlines detailing Eleanor Vance's conviction and imprisonment. It wasn't in the restructuring of a corporate empire. It was here, in this building, in the faces of the young, hopeful students in the audience. She had taken the power she had won, the resources she had gained, and used them not to mimic her oppressor's destructiveness, but to create a positive, enduring legacy that was a direct and potent counterpoint to everything Eleanor Vance stood for. She had transformed the ashes of her past into the foundation for someone else's future. She finished her speech and looked out at the crowd, at Grant and Elliot, at the vibrant, hopeful energy of the city. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, a smile of peace, of purpose, of a battle finally, truly won.